London's underworld was filled with names that carried weight, men who thrived in shadows and lived by the code of the streets. Some inspired respect, others provoked fear. But there was one name that went beyond both: Freddie Foreman. To the outside world, he looked like a quiet South London man, sharp in his suit, loyal to his family. But behind closed doors, Foreman was something far more dangerous. In the pubs and alleys of London, his name became legend. To speak it out loud was to summon fear. To cross him was to sign your own death warrant. They called him the Godfather. Not because of films or fiction, but because he ruled his corner of London with the same ruthless precision and unshakable loyalty you'd expect from the mafia itself. He wasn't loud like some gangsters. He wasn't flashy. He was patient, calculated, and above all, merciless. Freddie Foreman was the man people went to when a problem needed to disappear. He was the man the infamous Kray Twins trusted as their fixer, and he was the man who built his empire on fear, blood, and silence. But power like that never comes without a cost. Behind the smoke-filled clubs, the backroom deals, and the whispered threats lay a darker truth. Foreman's story is soaked in betrayal, violence, and regret, a story that blurs the line between loyalty and destruction. Tonight, we take you inside that story, a journey into the rise and fall of one of Britain's most ruthless gangsters. This is the world of Freddie Foreman, the godfather who ruled London's underworld. For decades, Freddie Foreman's shadow loomed over the heart of London. In the quiet suburbs, neighbors saw a man devoted to his family, polite, sharp-dressed, always composed. But in the dark corners of the city, in smoky pubs and backroom deals, his reputation was carved into stone, ruthless, cunning, and untouchable. To some, Foreman was more than just a gangster. He was the embodiment of the old underworld code: loyalty, silence, and power. To others, he was Britain's most dangerous mob boss, a man who built his empire not on trust, but on fear. They whispered his name with caution, because Freddie Foreman was not the kind of man you wanted to cross. His life story reads like a crime thriller. From petty street jobs in post-war Battersea to standing shoulder to shoulder with the infamous Kray Twins, Foreman's rise was built on blood and loyalty. He became the man everyone turned to when problems needed solving, the fixer, the enforcer, the godfather of London's violent underworld. But his reign was not without darkness. Behind the sharp suits and quiet demeanor lay a history of violence, bank heists, brutal murders, and whispers of bodies that vanished, never to be found again. His presence commanded fear, yet his silence commanded even more. Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth and legend. We dive deep into the making of a gangster, the empire he built, and the inevitable downfall that followed. This is not just the story of Freddie Foreman. It is the story of London's most feared godfather, a man whose name still echoes through the criminal history of Britain. Freddie Foreman's story begins in Battersea, South London, in the 1930s. It was a world still scarred by the Great Depression, and then by the devastation of World War II. Poverty wasn't just common, it was expected. Families scraped by, children grew up fast, and the streets became their playgrounds, and often, their battlegrounds. For young Freddie, survival meant toughness. He wasn't born into privilege, he was born into hardship. His father was often absent. His family had little money, and Battersea was filled with kids who learned early that fists spoke louder than words. In this unforgiving environment, Foreman developed the qualities that would later define him: resilience, sharp instincts, and a cold willingness to do whatever it took to get ahead. By his teenage years, Freddie was already running with local street gangs. At first, it was small crimes, petty thefts, breaking into shops, hustling on corners. But even then, he stood out. While other boys were reckless, Freddie was careful. He learned how to pick his moments, how to stay silent, and most importantly, how to avoid getting caught. These early lessons became the foundation of his future empire. Post-war London was a city in transition. Bomb sites still scarred the landscape, jobs were scarce, and crime thrived in the shadows. Black markets flourished, stolen goods passed through pubs like currency, and a clever man could make a fortune in the cracks of a broken system. Freddie was that man. He started moving from petty theft into organized crime, forming alliances with older, more experienced gangsters. One of Foreman's greatest strengths was his ability to inspire both fear and respect. Even as a young man, he carried himself with a seriousness that others noticed. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't need to be. He understood something most criminals didn't, that reputation was a weapon. People began to whisper his name in Battersea, not because of wild stunts, but because he always delivered. If Foreman promised something, he kept his word, whether it was a business deal or a threat. By the 1950s, Freddie had already graduated from the small-time street hustler to a reliable enforcer for local gangs. He knew how to collect debts, how to intimidate rivals, and when necessary, how to use violence without hesitation. His calm, almost businesslike approach to brutality earned him a chilling nickname. Brown Bread Fred, Cockney rhyming slang for dead. It was a name that suggested finality. If Foreman was after you, the outcome was certain. But Foreman wasn't just muscle. He was strategic. He had a vision of rising above petty street crime, of building something bigger. He watched carefully, studying the way other crime bosses moved, how they controlled territories, how they built networks of loyalty, and how they used fear as currency. Unlike many of his contemporaries who spent their money as quickly as they made it, Foreman thought long-term. His rise also coincided with the growing power of East End gangs, particularly the notorious Kray Twins. Though their paths would soon cross, at this stage, Foreman was carving out his own corner of the underworld in South London. He controlled protection rackets, smuggling operations, and quietly made a name as someone who could be trusted to handle the dirtiest work without leaving a trace. By the end of the 1950s, Freddie Foreman was no longer just another face in Battersea. He was a rising figure in London's criminal landscape, feared by rivals and respected by allies. He had transformed himself from a boy of poverty into a man of power. The making of a gangster was complete, and soon his name would be linked with some of the most infamous figures in British crime history. This was just the beginning of a reign that would make him legendary. But as history would show, legends are built on blood, and Freddie Foreman was only getting started. By the early 1960s, Freddie Foreman's name was no longer just whispered in Battersea. It was known across London's criminal underworld. His calm ruthlessness and reputation as Brown Bread Fred had made him a man people respected and feared in equal measure. But it was his connection to two of the most infamous gangsters in British history that would cement his legend forever, Ronnie and Reggie Kray. The Kray Twins ruled the East End with iron fists and velvet gloves. On one hand, they were darlings of the media, photographed with celebrities and parading through nightclubs. On the other, they were brutal mobsters who thrived on intimidation, protection rackets, and bloodshed. The twins weren't just feared, they were notorious, and they needed someone they could trust to handle the kind of problems that couldn't be solved with publicity or charm. That man was Freddie Foreman. Freddie met the Krays through London's tight-knit gangster circles. From the beginning, there was mutual respect. Ronnie and Reggie saw in Freddie what others had already recognized, a man who carried himself with quiet authority, someone who didn't brag, didn't draw unnecessary attention, but could deliver results. Foreman, in turn, saw in the Krays an opportunity to expand his influence beyond South London. Together, they formed a deadly alliance. Freddie became more than an associate. He became their trusted fixer. When the Krays needed someone silenced, Freddie handled it. When bodies needed to disappear, Freddie knew exactly how to make them vanish. One of the most infamous cases linked to him was the disposal of Jack the Hat McVitie, a gangster murdered by Reggie Kray in 1967. According to Underworld whispers, it was Foreman who ensured that Jack's body was never found. To this day, the mystery of McVitie's final resting place fuels the legend of Freddie Foreman's ruthless efficiency. But loyalty wasn't just about violence. Freddie was a man of the old code. Once you earned his trust, he stood by you. That's why the Krays valued him so highly. While many gangsters in London sought fame and recognition, Freddie preferred the shadows. He didn't crave the spotlight. He craved power, control, and respect. His role with the Krays also revealed another side of his character, his ability to balance family life with a life of crime. At home, he was a devoted father and husband. To his children, he was simply dad. To his wife, he was a provider. But outside those doors, he was the Godfather of South London, enforcing the will of the Krays and expanding his own empire in the process. The combination of Foreman's cold precision and the Krays' violent charisma made them a near unstoppable force. They controlled clubs, rackets, and entire neighborhoods. Business owners paid up not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. To resist meant ruin, or worse. And if anyone doubted that, Foreman's quiet stare was enough to remind them of the consequences. The press painted the Krays as Britain's own version of the mafia. Headlines screamed of gangland murders and clubland wars. But behind every headline was a network of men like Foreman, who ensured that the Krays' power wasn't just built on celebrity, but on the brutal enforcement of fear. Still, even in this world of loyalty, cracks would eventually form. The Krays' increasing hunger for fame drew more attention from the police, and their reckless violence began to expose them. For Foreman, loyalty was everything. But loyalty to the wrong men could also mean downfall. For now, though, the alliance was strong. Freddie Foreman was at the height of his power, feared across London and respected as the godfather who made problems disappear. His name was etched into the very fabric of the underworld. But power in the criminal world is never permanent, and soon, the empire they had built on fear would begin to crumble. The Kray Twins gave Freddie Foreman a seat at the table of London's underworld. But Freddie wasn't the type of man to remain in anyone's shadow for long. While his loyalty to the twins was unshakable, he had ambitions of his own. He didn't crave fame, he didn't pose for cameras, but behind the scenes, he was quietly building an empire that was every bit as dangerous as the Krays. By the mid-1960s, Foreman controlled vast swathes of South London. Protection rackets became his bread and butter. Pubs, betting shops, nightclubs. If they were making money, they were paying Freddie Foreman. It wasn't a matter of choice. Business owners knew that refusing meant broken windows, broken bones, or worse. But Foreman wasn't reckless. Unlike younger, more impulsive gangsters, he ran his operations with a calculated precision. He offered protection as both a threat and a service. Those who paid him were left alone, often even shielded from rival gangs. Those who didn't simply disappeared. Fear became Foreman's greatest weapon. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to wave a gun in someone's face. His reputation did the work for him. People said that when Foreman walked into a room, the air grew heavy. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was enough. This aura of quiet menace made him one of the most respected and most feared figures in London's criminal hierarchy. Money poured in, and with it came influence. Foreman expanded into smuggling, armed robberies, and black market deals. He was a man who understood opportunity. When Britain tightened restrictions on certain goods, Foreman's men smuggled them in. When cash was needed for a big job, he knew who to call and how to get it done. His empire wasn't just built on brute force, it was built on strategy. One of the most notorious jobs linked to him was the so-called £26 million Security Express robbery in 1983, one of the biggest heists in British history. Though his involvement was debated, the whispers tied him once again to the upper echelons of organized crime. To many, it proved what they already knew. Freddie Foreman wasn't just muscle. He was the brains of Britain's underworld. But empire came with blood. Stories circulated of men who crossed Foreman and never returned home. Jack the Hat McVitie's disappearance was only one example. Rivals, debtors, and traitors all found themselves on the wrong side of Foreman's cold logic. To him, violence wasn't personal. It was business. And in his business, loose ends weren't tolerated. Yet despite the violence, Foreman remained disciplined. Unlike the Krays, who basked in their notoriety, Foreman preferred to remain a shadow. He lived by a code: never attract unnecessary attention. To his family, he was a father and a husband. To his associates, he was a leader who commanded respect. And to the wider world, he was a name that haunted the whispers of London's pubs and alleys. At the height of his power, Foreman represented something more than just a gangster. He was the embodiment of an old-fashioned kind of organized crime, the kind built on fear, silence, and loyalty. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't flamboyant, and that made him even more dangerous. Because while others played at being gangsters, Freddie Foreman was the gangster. But empires built on fear can't last forever. As the years went on, police pressure mounted. Surveillance grew tighter. Old friends began to turn informant. And while Foreman remained loyal to his code, loyalty was becoming rare in a world where survival meant betrayal. For now, however, Freddie Foreman's grip on London's underworld was unshakable. He was the Godfather in all but name, a man whose empire thrived in the shadows, and whose legend grew with every whispered story of violence and fear. The empire was his. But the fall was coming. Every empire built on fear eventually attracts an enemy too powerful to silence. For Freddie Foreman, that enemy was the law itself. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, London's underworld was changing. The golden age of old-school gangsters was fading. New generations of criminals, less disciplined, more reckless, were rising. Drugs began flooding the streets, bringing chaos to a world that had once operated under unwritten rules. For a man like Foreman, who believed in loyalty and structure, the new era was dangerous. It wasn't just rivals he had to watch out for anymore. It was his own allies. The police, too, were becoming more relentless. The days when gangsters could operate with near impunity were ending. Detectives were building cases, gathering evidence, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And Foreman, despite his careful reputation, had left enough shadows behind to haunt him. One of the first cracks came with the infamous Security Express robbery in 1983, one of the biggest cash heists in British history. Though Foreman denied direct involvement, his name surfaced in whispers, and investigators began circling. Then there were the older cases, like the disappearance of Jack the Hat McVitie. Rumors had always tied Foreman to the disposal of McVitie's body, and while the evidence was thin, suspicion never went away. As the walls closed in, betrayal crept closer. Men who had once sworn loyalty began cutting deals with police to save themselves. Informants revealed names, operations, and hideouts. In a world where silence was sacred, the code was breaking apart. Foreman had always believed loyalty was unshakable, but even he couldn't hold back the tide of treachery. Eventually, the law caught up. Foreman faced trial for multiple charges, including robbery and murder-related cases. Courtrooms that once feared to speak his name now echoed with testimony against him. Old allies turned witnesses. The very empire he had built through fear and silence was unraveling piece by piece in the public eye. Prison became his new reality. For a man who had built his life on control, the cold steel bars were a bitter irony. Inside, he carried his reputation like armor. Other inmates respected him, some even feared him, But prison stripped him of the power he once held on the streets. It was no longer about making people disappear. It was about surviving the long, endless days behind walls. The fall of Freddie Foreman wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. His downfall marked the end of an era. The age of the Krays and their contemporaries had passed. The new criminal world, drug-fueled, chaotic, and unpredictable, didn't have room for old codes of honor. Men like Foreman were relics of a bygone underworld, caught between loyalty and a system that was crumbling from within. Yet even in defeat, Foreman remained defiant. He rarely admitted guilt, insisting he was a businessman, not a murderer. But his silence on certain subjects, especially the whispers about bodies that vanished, spoke louder than words. To this day, there are questions that only Freddie Foreman could answer. Questions he chose to carry with him, locked behind a code he never fully abandoned. For the police, his capture was a victory. For the public, it was the unmasking of a man who had ruled the shadows for decades. And for the underworld, it was a warning. Even the most feared godfathers could fall. The legend of Freddie Foreman, however, did not die in prison. It lived on in whispers, in books, in documentaries, and in the fearful respect of those who still remembered his reign. His empire had fallen, but his name remained immortal. By the time Freddie Foreman walked free from prison, the world outside had changed. London was no longer the city he had ruled with fear. The pubs and clubs where he had once held sway had been replaced by gleaming towers, and the underworld itself had shifted. The old guard was gone. Drugs, gangs, and international crime syndicates had taken over. For the first time, Foreman was no longer the predator. He was a survivor from another age. In his later years, Foreman became something few could have predicted: a storyteller. Books, documentaries, and interviews painted him not just as a gangster, but as a man reflecting on the violent life he had led. To some, he was brutally honest. To others, he was careful, revealing just enough to keep the legend alive while leaving the darkest truths unspoken. He often insisted he was a businessman, not a killer. Yet he never denied his role in the underworld. He admitted to robberies, to intimidation, to enforcing debts. But when it came to the whispers of murders and the disposal of bodies, he remained silent, bound by the old code. "Some things," he once said, "are better left buried." What made Foreman fascinating in old age was the contradiction. On one hand, he was the feared godfather, brown-bread Fred, the man who made problems vanish. On the other, he was a frail grandfather figure, speaking calmly about the past, as though recounting history rather than crime. That contrast kept audiences captivated. He wasn't just a gangster anymore, he was a living relic of Britain's criminal history. But behind the calm exterior, there was also bitterness. Foreman felt betrayed by the very world he had once dominated. He had lived by loyalty, but loyalty had not been returned. Old friends had testified against him. The code of silence had been shattered. To him, prison wasn't just punishment. It was proof that the underworld he had built his life around no longer existed. And yet, there were glimpses of pride. He spoke of his family with warmth, insisting that everything he did was, in part, to provide for them. He maintained that he wasn't a monster, but a man shaped by a brutal environment. A world where survival demanded ruthlessness. The public remained divided. Some saw him as a cold-blooded villain who had escaped true justice. Others saw him as a man of principle, loyal to his friends, never betraying his code even when it cost him everything. Documentaries called him the last godfather, and in many ways, it was true. With the Krays long gone and other old-school gangsters either dead or forgotten, Freddie Foreman was the final survivor of a blood-soaked generation. As he aged into his 80s and 90s, his reflections became almost philosophical. He acknowledged regret, but not in the way most expected. He regretted trusting the wrong people. regretted that loyalty had vanished from the underworld, regretted that the code he lived by no longer had a place. But when asked if he regretted the life itself, he often paused, gave a small smile, and left the answer hanging in the air. That silence was perhaps his greatest legacy, because Freddie Foreman's story has always lived in the space between truth and legend, between what he admitted and what he kept buried, between the man he was at home and the godfather he was in the streets. Today, his name remains etched in Britain's criminal folklore. To some, he will forever be the ruthless gangster who ruled London's underworld. To others, he will always be the loyal family man who got caught in the darkness of his times. But to history, he will be remembered as both, the last great Godfather of London and a man whose shadow still stretches over the city's forgotten alleys.